Good Yantiv and Chag Sameach. Since the beginning of COVID, but perhaps even earlier than that, knowing that we do Yizkor 4 times a year on each of the festivals and also on Yom Kippur, I always look for some kind of a connection to our doing Yizkor, which contains obviously the same language, the same words, each time we do it, and the moment that we find ourselves in. So the question that I deal with is there something particular about Yizkor and Shavuot? Is there something that ties Yizkor to Shavuot that would be a little bit different than Yizkor on Yom Kippur or Sukkot or Pesach? And then also I know that we all feel differently about Yizkor each time we do it, perhaps because of the passage of time in our lives, our own maturity in the way we respond to life and death, psychologically, spiritually, emotionally. That changes over time. The length of time between the death of the loved ones we remember and the moment that we sit here, but perhaps even more importantly, what's going on in the world. We're living in a world now where we just mark the death of the country, where we mark the death of the 1 millionth victim of COVID. So we live in many ways right now in the midst of a very challenged world and in a very tragic world. So this is Shavuot, and this is the time where we celebrate the giving of the Torah. You notice it's expressed as the giving of the Torah, not the receiving of Torah. And that's because our challenge is to receive Torah in our own lives whenever we can, perhaps as much as we can. The Torah was given to our people once, according to the tradition, and we celebrate that today. But it's our job to receive the Torah. We learn Ki heim chayenu v'yorech yameinu. That's what we say about the Torah. For they, the words of Torah, are our life, and they are the length of our days. This is Shavuot, and in the Torah it's not mentioned at all as Zman Matan Toratenu, but it's Chag HaBikurim. It is the holiday of the first fruits. And as I mentioned the other night when I introduced our Tikkun, I mentioned the fact that our rabbis, the leaders of our communities, they were faced with a great challenge at the time of our destruction, the exile from the land of Israel, the destruction of Jerusalem and our holy temple. For so much of our religious tradition, our observances and our celebration were tied to what we did in that temple, and we didn't have it anymore. And so we had to go through a whole process of religious what's the word I want to use? Kind of a religious reformation of our own. What was it going to be when we couldn't bring the first fruits to the temple? And that's where we began this idea of Shavuot and the receiving of Torah. You know, we're scribing a Torah here, and I've spoken a lot about it. And those of you who have come and witnessed the scribing know that we're doing the scribing under a chuppah. Now, that's not always done with Torah scribing, for sure, but we've chosen to do that. And the reason that we've chosen to do that is we understand the Torah is the ketubah of our people. Through the Torah, we understand that our relationship with God is a relationship of love. And in spite of the attacks on the legalistic nature of Judaism and its judgments, we make a case for Judaism, our people, and our God being connected through love. We entered into the relationship with a covenant, and there at Sinai we were married. There at Sinai we were married as we received the Torah. Now, like in any marriage, the Torah tells some stories of the history of the relationship. And we know that sometimes the relationship between the people and God was troubling. It was challenged. Sometimes it was very beautiful, but often very testy. But the relationship always held promise, and it continues to hold promise, because there's a commitment. We are committed to our God through our Torah, and God is there for us. And through this relationship, through this Torah, we do learn about our past and the people of our past, and we also learn about our expected behavior. A great Jewish thinker in the modern world once said that we don't show love to our children by saying to them, go do whatever you want to do, have a good time. No, we show love to our children when we indicate direction and when we give them rules and we set boundaries. So here it is, Shavuot, celebrating the giving of Torah, celebrating this love document between God and us. Now, over the last couple years, as I said, I've tried to make these connections with the holidays. And as I prepared for Shavuot this year and for this moment, I was thinking not only of the different levels of the meanings of this holiday, and they are profound. And I learned so much from them consistently as I studied the text. But I also began to wonder about loss, personal loss on this holy day, and what is the connection? And I landed on something that has to do with loss and love. It has to do with love and death. Love and what comes after we've lived out our days, or in certain cases after we survive the deaths of those who we love. So Yizkor forces us into rather philosophical corners, but it also brings us to a place that's deeply personal, and I know that's why some of you come on Yizkor. Both of these seem to end with the same conclusion. It's about that which outlives death. What do we have once our loved ones are gone? Certainly there's memory, but I think what's essential in that memory is the love of the person, the mother, the father, the sister, the brother, the husband, the wife, the child that we lost. I want to share the story of two lives that were very much intertwined this morning. I have found over time, I can reflect on Yizkor, as I said, in a philosophical way, but at the end of the day, I know how personal it is. I know how personal it is for you, and I know how personal it is for me, and how personal it is for those of us who have shared in loss. I was enriched to learn of the lives of these two people. But before I do so, I do want to remind you of something. I want to remind you of the second bracha that was recited as everyone comes to the Aliyah, the Torah. And I want to remind you of it, and I know I've done so before, because I find that every time I pick up the Siddur, I could find something new, but there's certain words that we recite when we sit here that don't leave me and touch me in a really deep way. And one of those is the passage or the bracha, Asher natan lanu Torat emet v'chayei olam nata b'tochenu. And that means we are praising God who's given us a Torah of truth and has planted within us eternal light, eternal life. Often I stand at a graveside after shoveling earth on the coffin. Loved ones will ask me the following question. They'll say, so Rabbi, is that all there is? What happens next? I can't answer that question. I can often, I'll often respond with, what do you think? I have some ideas, but ultimately I can't know. And I will say, what will you bring from here of your loved one now that he or she is no longer with you in body? What lives on? And I know and you know that what lives on is the love of the people we loved. Sometimes it's passion for a cause, and sometimes it's the love they had for this created world. But most often it's the love they had for you. When we love someone, we give them something that never goes away. And when we have been loved, we receive something that is a part of us forever. So in the Aliyah, what is being said is that the love of Torah is planted within us. And when we connect to the Torah, we connect to the lives of those who were before us. Sometimes it was in the love of lighting Shabbat candles or hearing the Kiddush or celebrating a cherished moment, or simply the love of living a Jewish life in a Jewish community and with a family. So I mentioned there were two lives that I learned about this year, and I give tribute to them this morning. I was so deeply touched by each of them. They are part of my consciousness, although I did not know them previously. One is a rabbi that I only met once, and I only met him on a telephone call. I had called him because he had some information, knowledge of a young man who tragically died much too early. He was the young man's rabbi. The rabbi is a man by the name of Douglas Goldhammer. The young man who was not yet 40 years old was David Herskovitz. David was the son of Rita and Tom, members of this shul, and Rita sits here this morning. David was incredible. He was brilliant, very talented in almost everything he did. And he was deeply committed to making the world better through his capacity to create models of funding to sources that create clean energy, renewable energy, to give our planet a future. He was inspired to do so through a visit he once made to Israel and how much he learned on that visit. As I said, he was brilliant at everything he did. At a very young age, he wasn't yet 40 when he died, he achieved so much. But more than that, this very successful and brilliant young man was really brilliant in his relationships of love with his wife Casey, his sister Catherine, and Rita and Tom. And everyone who knew him knew that there was something about him that transcended what most people did or the way most people appeared in the world. Do all of us know people like that? A beautiful man, beautiful because of his kindness and his charisma and his devotion to causes and people that mattered. He had one of those winsome personalities. He had lots of devoted friendships. What he wanted to accomplish, he set his mind on it and he could accomplish it. He was great looking, he was a great athlete, he had natural gifts, and he had gifts which he developed. But he was always appreciative of what he received and fully aware that he had obligations to others and obligations to give back. One didn't come across a man like David Herskovitz often in one's life. My story of David goes back to when he was 13 years old. And this I learned from Rabbi Goldhammer, his rabbi. He told me that David mesmerized his congregation in the way that he read Torah. And he read Torah at his bar mitzvah in 3 languages and continued to return to that synagogue in Skokie to read Torah. He read it perfectly in Hebrew. He then would translate it into English, and then he read it in modern American Sign Language. You see, David's maternal grandparents were deaf, and their congregation in Skokie was a very, very special congregation that's first devoted to the deaf community. But it was open to everybody. Its devotion to the deaf community meant that it would always be a small congregation. Signing was critical to its communications. Everything they do is spoken and translated into American Sign Language. David's reading and signing were so beautiful that he made everyone there, those who were deaf and those who could hear, equally proud of him as a young man. For David, though his words were not empty words, to him, as he read Parshat Nitzavim and everybody stood equally before God in that Parsha, he internalized those words. From the stranger to the hewer of wood to the elders and the officers, David, like his rabbi, treated everyone equally, whether they were rich or poor, whether they were hearing or deaf. He loved to study with his rabbi, who was intertwined in this story, and coincidentally, they both died this year. Rabbi Goldhammer also died prematurely. He was just in his early 70s. I spoke to him on the phone, as I mentioned, and he told me that David had the kindest heart of anyone he had ever known. He said we would talk about the economic disparities that exists in this world and that exist between the deaf and hearing communities. And he told me that David would immediately volunteer to raise money for any project that helped the underserved. He raised money in particular for their food pantry. He understood and followed a particular precept. And when he told me the precept, I asked him, where'd he come with that one? And he said, it's mine. That's what Rabbi Goldhammer said. The precept is, be kind, and be kind. And those were words that the rabbi often spoke. It was his motto. It was his teaching. It was Rabbi Goldhammer's Torah. Rabbi Goldhammer was the first to tell me what was repeated by many, many others, that David was the kindest young man they had ever met. And to David, family was everything. And with all of his successes and his hard work and his engagement with people in so many places, he was really happiest just spending time with his family because their love was abounding. So I spoke with Rabbi Goldhammer and I learned about young David. And then I learned about Rabbi Goldhammer. Rabbi Goldhammer was brought up Orthodox. After college and graduate school, he chose to go to HUC, the Reform Seminary, where he was ordained as a rabbi. He was incredibly energetic and deeply, deeply concerned, not only for his family and for the people close to him, but for all people, and particularly those who were underserved and those who were differently abled or disabled. He met people who were deaf, and he became an expert in signing. And he realized that in the Chicago area, there was no synagogue for the deaf. And so he devoted his rabbinate to creating a community that integrated deaf and hearing people and their families. As I mentioned already, that choice limited the growth of his congregation, but he made that choice because he was driven by his kindness. He was a presence, brightly colored tallis, long red hair, a huge smile. His movements on the bima when you spoke to him were large, and they created an inclusiveness in a sense that this rabbi felt very deeply for every word and for every soul. When he spoke, he would jump about the bima as he spoke, and he sang, and he would laugh freely, and he would cry as equally freely. He was blinded to the weaknesses and the faults of other people, but he was brought to his knees by the brokenness of those he and his congregation served because of their disabilities. By the way, he was known because he trained Marley Matlin for her bat mitzvah. And when he was buried, his lovely wife buried him, and she stuck $5 in his pocket and some dog treats and cat treats in his other pocket. She said that her husband would never walk by anything living, anything with a need without giving a gift. So I'll tell you two things about Rabbi Douglas Goldhammer. First of all, he was born with a very large birthmark on his hand, and the doctors determined that the birthmark needed to be radiated. The doctors made a mistake, and they radiated him for much too long, and so from the time he was an infant, he lived with tremendous physical pain. Rabbi Goldhammer, long before he was a rabbi, used his pain to empathize with others. He claimed that his pain made him kinder. And so why did he die young? He was only 72. He died, what's that? 82? Oh, 72, yeah. He died because he served all communities in Skokie, and one night he was walking alone when a group of neo-Nazis got out of a car, attacked him, and beat the living daylights out of him. He survived the attack, but after that he physically was no longer the same. It was difficult for him to move. It was nearly impossible for him to stand, and his life of physical pain only got worse and worse. And that's when I spoke to him. After about 9 months living with tremendous disabilities from his beating and the pain that he had grown so accustomed to, he couldn't travel to Florida for David's funeral, but we spoke for a long time on the phone. And when he talked to me, he told me that he was desirous of meeting his attackers. He wanted to extend some humanity to them. He wanted them to see him, and he wanted to see them. And as I prepared for this sermon, then I was Googling stories about Rabbi Goldhammer and articles about him and his obituaries. And I was surprised because I couldn't find a single story, a single news story about the attack that took place in Skokie. And what I learned was that he had all of those stories removed from Google, because that's not how he wanted to be remembered as the rabbi who was attacked by anti-Semites. He wanted to be remembered for the good that was done. He wanted to be remembered for the congregation he created and sustained. He wanted to be remembered because he lived a life of kindness and love. He didn't want pity. He didn't want attention. He wanted to spread kindness. Every once in a while in the world we meet some people like this, although it's quite rare. And it's not unusual to meet people like this whose lives intersect with other people who are also filled with that kind of kindness and love and compassion. And often it is because of the influence that they had on each other at that intersection. It reflects a desire to live a very full, a holy human life. It's about a desire to spread kindness. I know that both of these lives deeply impacted the world. And I know the love they give and the commitments they had remain a part of their families and their communities. And they go way, way beyond that. Neither David nor Rabbi Goldhammer would ever think they would be the subject of a sermon here, and you all know more about them. Their love then touches each and every one of us at this moment. I know how painful it is. I know. We're about to do Yizkor. We're going to remember all of those who have gone before us. And as importantly, though, we're going to take the gifts that they had and that they gave us, the spirits and the love, and we will do our best to make them just a little part of our lives in the future that we commit ourselves to. The type of community that we want to create, the way we want to be amongst the people we are near, the people we meet, the people we live with. That's the best objective of Yizkor. Let it allow us to take the love of those who came before us and make us a bit more loving and a bit more kind. We have to do our best not to allow death to embitter us. It's the reality that all of us share. But also let us do our best to embody the words of Rabbi Goldhammer as he described David Herskovitz. Be kind, be kind, be kind.